So for example, Blockstream has actually adopted a more okay.
It's all downhill from here. This is it. There's no going back. Do you want to? You can say it differently.
Yeah, I'm gonna say it differently. Okay. So for example, the Twitter's Innovators Patent Agreement has been adapted by Blockstream.
I'm sorry. That was the last.
It's so good. This is so funny.
So why don't you tell me a little bit about yourself and your background, how you got into law and specifically technology, intellectual property?
Sure. So I'm an intellectual property and technology lawyer at Ropes & Gray in the Silicon Valley. And I actually knew I was going to be an intellectual property lawyer and technology lawyer when I was in 9th grade.
Really?
I know, isn't that crazy? So I did this genomics portion of bio, whatever 9th grade bio, and I thought it was the coolest thing. And so I remember I had this conversation with my dad, and I was like, Dad, I'm thinking I'm gonna go get a PhD in genomics, and maybe then be a lawyer in the genomics space. And he was like, Oh, Marta, you don't need a PhD from that. You can just be a lawyer and do genomics cases. Right?
You don't have to be a scientist and a lawyer.
Yeah. And so I just sort of was really, and I was like, that is incredible. So I just took a bunch of science classes. I was really interested in science in college, took a bunch of science classes, took a bunch of computer science, and, ultimately became a lawyer and get to just do these cases and, love technology. And, sort of around 2015, kind of became aware of this new cryptocurrency thing and got really into it, and things kind of spiraled.
Wow, so you knew right away. You're doing exactly what you wanted to do.
I know, it's super unusual. Yeah, but I do. I'm doing exactly what I wanted to do. Yeah.
What were you doing before this whole, blockchain cryptocurrency trend came around? You said before 2015.
Yeah, generally I'm a IP litigator at Ropes & Gray. And so I also do intellectual property litigation. And one of the things that is actually what got me into blockchain is the thing that I was sort of focusing on is patent pledges. So the way that companies can patent things, patent their ideas, and then actually within their industry sort of license it to each other so that everyone has access to the technology, but people are still able to protect their ideas, like how you strike that balance. And there was a blockchain industry group that was trying to figure out how to do that. There were so many blockchain patents, and they were trying to figure out how you actually are able to patent blockchain in a way that comports with the ideals of open source. Right? Because on the one hand, it's open source technology. On the other hand,
Right. And we'll get into all this. I find it super fascinating. I mean, this whole blockchain thing has just exploded in the last couple of years, and it's still just in the beginning.
Absolutely.
So I think we were all super excited to find a lawyer that specializes in blockchain and especially intellectual property regarding that. So can you tell us a little bit about what is your whole firm technology rooted?
So it's a large law firm, and we have lots of different practice groups. And the practice group I'm in is the intellectual property litigation group. And so we're across offices all over the United States. We have offices around the world. It's a pretty big Boston-based law firm from the 1800s.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, kind of a contrast with the technology.
So it didn't start off as a blockchain.
Definitely not. Okay. But
I'd be super impressed if it was. So is technology kind of like a subcategory within the intellectual property category?
So there are a couple of us in the group that do blockchain-related work, and we also do blockchain-related work at the firm in other practice groups. So there are other practice groups that focus on, for example, securities, like investments, funds that represent companies in those types of endeavors in the blockchain space.
How is your firm and all the people that are kind of taking blockchain into consideration, how are they handling this new frontier, especially like when it first started, when you were saying around 2015?
I think the thing that's so great about Ropes and Gray is these are people who are just really interested in technology. Like our technology group, our intellectual property group are just people who are fascinated by this stuff and just love doing the work. And so a lot of them have just been really curious and open-minded about blockchain. And everyone, has been really, really supportive of, the work that the people who are doing blockchain at Ropes and Gray, are doing. And I think they just see it as a really interesting new frontier that they're excited to be a part of.
Have you guys had a lot of cases with this? Because I can't imagine there's a lot of precedent for these types of cases, right?
Yeah. So right now, what we're doing is a lot of advising companies, particularly in the intellectual property and also the policy spaces. So at this point, I have not personally handled the litigation involving blockchain, though I think the likelihood that we go, a significant amount of time without some sort of intellectual property litigation in the blockchain space is low. A lot of people are predicting sort of blockchain patent wars coming. And so at this point, luckily, not a lot of litigation there. And there is a lot of litigation already in the sort of securities area. So, investments and whether creating a new coin is is creating a security. So there is a lot of litigation there that I personally am not handling.
I feel like, not knowing anything about this space, I feel like I just imagine, lawyers and judges and everyone just like, I don't know, like what do we do?
So I think you have to always sort of, everything is by analogy, right? So you kind of analogize to previous technologies or, previous areas of the law. Sure. But you're absolutely right. I think that is particularly relevant for regulators who are just trying to figure out what to do and how to regulate it. And, wanting to strike a balance between, on the one hand, protecting consumers, which is their job, and on the other hand, not wanting to quash the innovation in the space.
Right. Yeah. Right. How to add regulation to a deregulated concept.
Right, exactly. Yeah, at its core, right, the whole concept of Bitcoin and blockchain is really about decentralization, lack of centralized control, which is somewhat at odds with the concept of government intervention generally, but a lot of the more established blockchain companies are really open to the regulation. And regulators have been, I think, shockingly measured in many ways in making sure that they're striking the right balance. Yeah, I definitely want to talk about all this too. It's just all so interesting. But first, I think it would probably be really great for us to kind of jump into what is blockchain. Because I think for the majority of people, like people that aren't super into either the tech world or like, the hyper finance world and kind of, are getting this and knowing what's going on with all of this innovation, these are words that they hear, but they have no idea what it means. And I think there's a lot of, misconceptions or just falsehoods out there that people just don't know. Like, I think probably at this point, most people have heard of like Bitcoin. And then because of that, they've probably heard of blockchain. I think some people think they're kind of the same thing, or cryptocurrencies and blockchain are the same thing. So I would love for us to just kind of do some blockchain 101, as you put it. Yes, absolutely. Which is a great way of putting it. Yeah. So if you don't mind telling us, like, what is blockchain? Great. So the concept of a blockchain arose in 2008. And the first sort of application of a blockchain was Bitcoin. So before Bitcoin, or sort of without Bitcoin, the way that value gets transferred between, like, let's say I wanted to transfer you $20. The way that happens is I go to my bank. My bank is keeping a ledger. I tell my bank I want to send $20 to you. My bank then communicates with your bank via 1960s ACH technology. Eventually your bank has its ledger and it updates its ledger. And eventually, both ledgers reflect that $20 has been sent to you. The concept of a blockchain is actually, and this is the concept behind Bitcoin, is actually really simple. Instead of having my bank have a ledger and your bank have a ledger, and we just trust these banks to maintain these ledgers, what if instead we just had one ledger that everyone can see and that is stored on sort of everyone who is running the software's computers.
So
in
everyone has a
decentralized-
copy of it.
Right, effectively. And so everyone is sort of helping to maintain the software helping to maintain the ledger. And that ledger is decentralized. There's no one party, right, that can, like a bank, that can update it. So that's the sort of basic concept. And that ledger is called a blockchain. The reason it's called a blockchain is that essentially in Bitcoin, essentially about every 10 minutes, a new block of transactions is added to the ledger. So all the transactions that occurred in the last 10 minutes. Mm-hmm. And so it's added to the ledger and it's now a blockchain. So the best way to think of a blockchain is really just like a stack of pages, right? It's really just a ledger. So that's the concept behind blockchain. Mm-hmm. And Bitcoin has, the Bitcoin ledger, right? And when one is transferring Bitcoin, what it means is you're just transferring on the Bitcoin blockchain, right? Your transactions are being recorded on the Bitcoin blockchain, and that's how value is being transferred. Other cryptocurrencies just have their own blockchains, their own ledgers.
So you can have different blockchains for pretty much whatever you want, as long as someone can build it for you.
Absolutely. So you can just copy the code from the Bitcoin ledger and create your own ledger, right? And that has the exact same code, works the exact same way. It's just you're starting from zero, and now that's whatever coin, whatever you want to call it.
Like some companies now are even creating their own intercompany blockchains for just, the people within their company. So not the public, right? Is that just to give an example of the uses?
Yeah. So the use case that is I think the most common that's very similar to what you're talking about is these ICOs, initial coin offerings. And the idea is that you as a company can just create your own cryptocurrency, just sort of copy the code or create your own code and have a blockchain and sort of have your own ledger. So it could be whatever your company name is, coin, right? Mm-hmm. And what you can do with that is, sort of whatever you want. But one thing you could do with it is you could say, in order to use my product, like let's say it's some sort of online product or service, you need to be using my coins, these coins. And so you will go buy these coins and then use them on the platform itself. So maybe you'll pay per view of an article using this coin, and the money will get transferred directly to the company or to maybe whoever wrote the article, right? So there are all sorts of interesting things you can do.
So why is blockchain blowing up? What are the benefits to blockchain that aren't in the systems that we're using right now in transferring money and assets?
So a couple things. The first thing is these transactions happen effectively instantly. They happen with, in theory, zero, but in practice, low transaction costs. Mm-hmm. And they don't require centralized institutions. And I think sort of in the US, we take for granted that we can trust centralized institutions with our money. But I think that is actually a really powerful thing, to not have to trust centralized institutions in other places around the world. So for example, the first time that there was a huge spike in the price of Bitcoin back in, I think it was 2013, one of these sort of huge spikes happened because the country of Cyprus had sort of gone into everyone's bank accounts and said, we're just gonna chop off a bunch of some percentage of people's bank accounts and use that. Yeah. And so in the wake of that, the price of Bitcoin spiked. And the reason the price of Bitcoin spiked is because the demand for Bitcoin spiked. And the reason is that a lot of people saw what Cyprus had done with these bank accounts and was like, oh, it actually might be really useful to have our money in a non-decentralized type of system.
Because it is true. I think because we've had no other financial system other than pretty much banks, or like having our money ourselves or held up in assets or something. That's the only way we know. So other than, we've just kind of trusted because we don't really have a choice, I guess. But when you really think about it, it is kind of, I don't want to say like tricky or anything, but like you hear something like that happen, you're like, well, yeah, I guess that is a possibility.
Right. And I think there are a lot of benefits even in countries where you do trust these centralized institutions. And frankly, the centralized institutions themselves have now started using blockchains just to increase efficiencies, between the banks or between, within sort of what we would think of as the established system. So there are also a lot of uses, in that sense as well.
Would we really need banks? I mean, yeah, I guess we would. I guess.
I mean, that's definitely a question at the sort of heart of the ethos of Bitcoin, right? Is the idea that definitely the ideal of Bitcoin coming from the cypher-punks, who sort of were the ones who were the early Bitcoin adopters, was that they would replace the need for centralized banks and currency.
And let's talk about, I know there's some other benefits that like are making this such a game changer. Yeah, I know security is one of them. So we were saying the speed of transactions. And real quick, can we talk about why it's so much faster?
Yeah, I think.
And how exactly it works.
Yeah, absolutely. The reason it's so much faster is it's a shared ledger, right? That everyone can see, as opposed to one institution having their own ledger and another institution having their own ledger and them having to communicate between it and update their ledgers separately.
And who works the transactions and approves them?
So the transactions are approved by consensus. So you essentially need, effectively, the software is, so the code behind Bitcoin, the idea is that there's this clever cryptography by which, as you are running, as transactions are happening, they're being validated by, in Bitcoin's case, at least 51% of sort of the computers on the network. And so as long as 51% of people agree, those 51%, that 51% of the network can validate transactions. So you may hear something about like a 51% attack in the context of Bitcoin. The idea behind that is if one party had access to more than 51% of the Bitcoin network, right, they could sort of put falsified transactions onto the network. But
which is possible, but very, very difficult to do, because you would just have to have an enormous computational resource in order to do that.
Yeah. So in Bitcoin's case, the Bitcoin network has more computing power behind it than, like, if you added up, there's some statistic, but if you added up hundreds of the world's most powerful supercomputers, right, and combined them all, the Bitcoin network still would be more powerful than that. And that's just because you have so many people running that software.
Right.
Other blockchains, though, right, that maybe don't have as much computing power behind them, are definitely more susceptible to something like a 51% attack.
Because it wouldn't be as difficult to get the computational resource to have over 51%.
Exactly.
Got it.
But the thing to note is, everything is publicly recorded. All these transactions are publicly recorded, right? So it is really easy, right, to then later go back and look and say, oh, look at these falsified transactions that happened. One thing that has happened one thing that's interesting about cryptocurrency is that you can just go back in time and duplicate the ledger and sort of just create a duplicate of the ledger that sort of takes away whatever transactions you don't want to have happened, and that's called forking. Mm-hmm. So you may have heard of the Etherium Fork. Ethereum is another cryptocurrency that is definitely worth talking about, and the Bitcoin fork too. But the idea being that, if you can take the ledger and sort of go back in time, and people can start using that ledger instead.
What would you want to do that for?
So what happened with Ethereum is, so Ethereum is a super cool application of cryptocurrency that allows you to essentially program your money. So if you've heard of so-called smart contracts, I find that kind of a misnomer. A better way to think of it is programmable money. So you can write computer programs that say, if X, then automatically transfer one millionth of an ether or a Bitcoin to this other person. So you can have these automated things that happen. And sort of program your money to do things.
So it's like a programmable contract. So it's not like, oh, are they gonna actually send me this money when X is done? It's in the code. It's happening.
Exactly. And it happens automatically, and it happens at such a micro scale that there are all sorts of really cool things you can do with it. So like, for example, in the copyright context, you could write a program that says for every second of a song that is played by a user, automatically transfer 1/1 millionth of a cent to the songwriter and 1/1 millionth of a cent to the singer. And that all happens automatically at this micro scale. And what Ethereum did that Bitcoin didn't, Ethereum just made it much, much easier to do that kind of programming with your money. So one of the first big things that happened in the Ethereum world was the creation of what was called the DAO, the DAO, the Distributed Autonomous Organization. So the idea was we can actually automate an organization using Ethereum, using programmable money, essentially. And they sort of raised a bunch of money. A lot of people contributed a lot of money to this Distributed Autonomous Organization, the DAO. And immediately it got hacked. There was a hack. There was a, not of the underlying ledger, right, but of the sort of things built on top of the ledger. And there was a, fluke in the code building on top of the ledger. It wasn't that the ledger itself got hacked, right? And a bunch of money, a bunch of cryptocurrency was stolen. And so what the Ethereum community did is they said, okay, well, why don't we go back in time to before this hack happened, and we'll just create a ledger that's exactly like the ledger, the Ethereum ledger, but we're just going to pick up at that point, that moment before the hack. And that was, and that was really controversial, and they ultimately did it. So right now there's Ethereum and there's Aetherium Classic. Aetherium Classic is sort of old Ethereum, which is the timeline of events where the hack happened, and Aetherium is...
So technically, Ethereum still exists. Oh, I'm sorry, Ethereum Classic still exists, but it's like, who was going to use that because it's vulnerable? So everyone has to agree to this fork, this change.
Right. So the Ethereum Classic itself is not vulnerable. It was not the underlying ledger that was vulnerable.
It was just at a certain point.
At a certain point, what happened is people built, so the ledger is just a ledger, right? And you build programs on top. Like you write code that says if X, then transfer some amount, right? That code built on top of it, of the ledger, is what allowed the hack to happen. It wasn't that the ledger itself was hacked, right? It's sort of like if your browser is buggy, on the internet, it's not that there's some underlying problem in the internet. It's that there's some bug in the browser, right? It's like a higher layer.
Yeah.
And so to clarify, it wasn't Ethereum Classic itself. It was just that the community said, well, we want to go back in time to before this hack happened. A lot of people lost a lot of cryptocurrency. We don't want to be in a world where these hackers have access to all this money. And so that is how this fork happened.
So how can they prevent that from happening again? If it's not the ledger itself and it's some, surface program or something, how can that not just happen again?
So that's just a matter of writing good code, right? That's an issue that is not unique to cryptocurrency, right? That's an issue that is a problem for banks, and everyone, right, has the same problem of making sure that your code is secure, right? And that's not an issue. My point is that that's not an issue of the cryptocurrency itself. That's just sort of a general problem.
Well, let's talk about the code a little bit, because it's the code that makes blockchain so secure. And I think that this is the part where I think people they're like, okay, I get that they say it's supposed to be secure, but I think it freaks a lot of people out to put their money into a cryptocurrency and then just have it in the digital world somewhere. So are you able to speak to how the stacking of the blocks and why that's so much more secure than how we do things now?
Sure.
Or how you can't just like hack it, like you hear of people hacking other programs all the time.
Yeah, absolutely. So the idea is that you have this ledger, and what you actually see on the ledger is not that sort of Marta transferred X amount of Bitcoin to Michele, but rather you see
that would be a problem.
That would be a problem, right? Exactly. That's exactly right. But rather you see the public key. Essentially, you can think of it like almost like a username. And I can use a different username for every username. I mean, that's, you know. And I could use a different username for every transaction. Or I could, have one username that I'm constantly using. And then you have sort of like a password, a private key. And both of these things are just numbers. They're just a string of numbers. And so what it means to have cryptocurrency is just to have your public key and your private key. That's it. So if you want to store cryptocurrency, you could actually just store it on a piece of paper by writing down the numbers, that the public and private key, right? So because there's a ledger out there that has your public key, your private key is going to prove that that's you and allow you to make transactions. So all you need is these two numbers. Some people have what's called a mind wallet, meaning they just memorize their numbers.
Right.
But that's what it means to have cryptocurrency. And so in that sense, it's secure. Like the ledger itself has, there's the layer of security involving the ledger itself, but there's also the layer of security involving the users, right? And in that sense, right, what you're really worried about is having those two numbers, like, keeping those numbers secret. And so that's what something like Coinbase does, these so-called wallets. Coinbase does other things as well. But if you hear of these wallets, all they're doing is storing these two numbers for you. Early on, there was something called Mt. Gox.
Yes.
I've
heard of this.
Yes. So this was early days. And Mt. Gox it actually stands for Magic the Gathering Online Exchange, MTGOX.
Of course it does.
Of course it does. And the
That's what I was
reason,
thinking.
yeah, exactly. And the reason that it is called that is because it was actually just an online exchange for Magic cards. And they were like, oh, there's this new thing, this new cryptocurrency thing. Let's also be an exchange. Not just for that, not just for Magic cards, right? And so they got hacked and they lost a bunch of sort of the public and private keys that people had been storing with them, and essentially lost a ton of money, falsified account balances, right? And so, so that sort of shows you that's not some underlying problem in the ledger itself, which is secure. That's the layer on top of it. That's, the human element or also the, right, how you're actually storing those numbers.
That's a human error.
That's a human error, and also, right, a code error, like an error of the code that they've built on top of the ledger, or in that case, of the code that they built in their system in order to just store your username and password.
So if you lose, and I've heard these two numbers, what are they called? You're saying the public
key, private key,
and the private key. I've heard them equated to like kind of an account number and then your PIN number.
Yeah, exactly. Username, password. One thing's public, one thing's private. Everyone can see the public thing. The private thing proves that you are the public thing, right? That you have access to.
And if you lose those, you're just kind of SOL?
That's it. You're SOL, right? And that's right. And that's one of the things, that's one of the risks with cryptocurrency, right? Is, in the US, your bank account is FDIC insured, by the government up to $100,000 per account, right? You have this sort of insurance. You have this security there. And also, that's not even to get into the fluctuating rates of exchanges, right? But that's not the case in cryptocurrency. If you lose, so you've probably heard of a lot of people losing their just the hard drives that they were maybe early miners in Bitcoin, and they just didn't think it was valuable at the time, and sort of their hard drive crashed, or they threw away their hard drive or whatever. Their hard drive was storing those usernames and those public and private keys, and once that's gone, that's gone. There's nothing you can do. There's no Bitcoin corporation you can call up on the phone and say, oh, I lost my username and password. That's not how that works. Yeah.
So doesn't that make it more, is it riskier to kind of put like any money or assets or whatever into this? And then if you lose that information, or if somebody has that information, that's essentially all you need. Or is that kind of the cost benefit? Like, well, yeah, it's riskier, but also you get the benefits of it being decentralized and deregulated.
Yeah. So I think that, again, that's the issue of keeping those layers, secure is an issue that is common to not just common among sort of other, that's just a thing that is a problem generally. That's not specific to cryptocurrency, right? Like banks also need to be able to keep their ledgers secure and be able to keep usernames and passwords secure. And that's just a problem. That's not a cryptocurrency problem.
Yeah. Now, how is the code of blockchain so, I don't want to say unhackable, but kind of? I think because knowing a little bit of coding, that's what I became most fascinated by when I actually started, because I would, Zach would talk about blockchain a lot. I'm like, okay, yeah, I'm kind of getting it. And once I actually got into like, okay, how is this thing actually programmed? That's when I got kind of really fascinated by it, because learning about, the hashes and which essentially, I don't know, feel free to take over whenever you want, but that each block of all these transactions you were talking about, the blocks that, build the chain, that they build off each other. And that, you have the Genesis block, first block, whatever chain, and then the second block that is rooted in the first block, third block is rooted in those two, fourth block in those three. So in order to hack one, you have to essentially be hacking all of them, which is almost impossible. That's what I would find fascinating.
Yeah. So I'll simplify a little bit, but I'll sort of talk about like at a oversimplified way what's going on there. So again, oversimplifying and glossing, and I'm sure people will object.
No, I'm sure they'll appreciate that.
but my oversimplified, non-mathematical way of explaining it is, so what you do is you have, these previous blocks that you come up with some numerical, some representation for. And then you have this math formula. Like, picture a math formula. And what you're doing is you're looking for a thing called it's called a nonce. Mm-hmm. There's this number that all these computers are trying to guess that when added to the numerical representation of all the other transactions that have already occurred, right? And when you run that through the NSA's secure hash algorithm twice, will come out with a certain answer. And that's how you are, and basically everyone is in a race. All your computers, what's happening every 10 minutes is all of your computers are in a race to come up with this nonce. Mm-hmm. And then once they fit, so all you're doing is it's a plug and play, right? You're just guessing and then plugging it into this algorithm and then seeing if what comes out is right? And once you have the nonce, right, the computer that sort of wins is the one that we know has the correct last 10 minutes of transactions, right? And so what happens is 51% of the other computers, or at least 51% of the other computers in the network, say, okay, you've told us this number. We're going to run that through the algorithm now that you've guessed it. Oh yeah, that got us the right answer. Mm-hmm. So in fact,
to verify.
That verifies, right. And that's why that's what those 51% of computers are doing. So in fact, that is the last 10 minutes of transactions that can now be added to the ledger.
And these people are called miners. The ones that are figuring out this algorithm, the ones verifying all these transactions, they're miners.
Exactly. So this is the mining process. And so this is actually how, in the Bitcoin context, this is how Bitcoin is created. And so basically, everyone who's running the software is mining, and is also, and what mining is sort of, in so doing, you are basically just doing this process. You're guessing and verifying, mm-hmm. right? And what happens is the person, the computer, once someone has guessed the right answer and therefore has added the last 10 minutes of blocks of transactions to the blockchain, that group or person or whatever gets a certain amount of newly created Bitcoin. So every 10 minutes-ish, a certain amount of Bitcoin is added.
And that's how they're compensated. That's their incentive for doing this in the first place.
Exactly.
Because without them, this would not work.
Exactly. So the idea is by running the software, by maintaining the network, you are actually, entering yourself into a lottery in a way to win that brand new Bitcoin. And that's mining. And that's how Bitcoin is created and distributed in the first instance.
Got it. How now you say Bitcoin is created every time someone figures out. Does that mean that the number of Bitcoins out there is constantly? Doesn't that do something to the value of it?
Yeah. So absolutely. So there will be only 21 million Bitcoins ever created. And essentially every 10...
Oh, they're mining, like gold mine.
Yeah, like gold mining, exactly.
Because there's only so much gold.
There's only so much gold. No, and that's actually a great way of like thinking about, like when you start thinking about like why is Bitcoin valuable, it's extremely helpful to just analogize it to gold.
Because there's a limited amount.
Exactly.
People are trying to pull them out.
Exactly. There's a limited amount. It's a good store of value. It's valuable because people think it's valuable. And it's very divisible. Like there are all sorts of really great analogies to gold. And when people say, well, why is this valuable? The answer is because people think it's valuable and, just like gold, right?
Right.
But yes. So where were we?
well, why can't they just
Yeah.
Why can't they build more? It's just in the code? I
know. So
that's
yes, so it's in the code. In the Bitcoin
answer,
code, there can only be 21 million ever. And what happens is every so often, so the number of new Bitcoins created is halving every so often. So, for a while, there are 25 new Bitcoins created every 10 minutes. Then there's 12.5. Then there's half of that. Then there's half of that. So if you picture sort of the graph, right, you're sort of approaching 21 million. Like as this number keeps, and so it'll be around the year 21 something that the last Bitcoin will be mined. But it gets harder and harder to mine Bitcoin, right? Because you're getting half the value of, every so often.
Wow.
Over time, right.
And what happens when you get there, when they're all mined?
Well, that's a great question, right? Because at that point, what's the incentive to be running the software? Right. And the answer, and that's a really interesting point, because there are also cryptocurrencies, right, that don't have limited amounts. So like when you talk about these ICOs, sometimes they will have a limited amount, but they just sort of have said they're going to have a limited amount.
But they haven't done it yet.
Well, I mean, if it's not sort of written into the code, there's nothing stopping a centralized company from making more, right? But yeah, that's one of the things that's so that makes Bitcoin something that's really tipped the market in a way, right? Is that there is a limited number. There's a limited amount, and that's part of what makes it valuable.
Yeah, because I would imagine if there's no end to it, then I mean, this is kind of like just like printing money, right?
Exactly. Right.
Yeah.
And keep in mind, of course, that the US dollar, right, is not backed by anything in particular either, right? We used to be on the gold standard where you'd get a certain amount of gold if you wanted to, but that's not actually, we just print more money, right? So, the concept is not a new one.
Right. So in theory, we're almost going back closer to the gold standard.
Absolutely. Yep. Absolutely.
Interesting. So interesting.
Yeah.
And okay, so Bitcoin was created, blockchain was created to get Bitcoin off the ground. I think a lot of people kind of get the idea of Bitcoin right now. What are some other uses outside of cryptocurrencies? And by cryptocurrencies, I mean mostly like, coins, that blockchain is great for.
Yeah. So anything you can use a ledger for, you can use a blockchain for. And it may, make things more efficient and add value. So one thing is being able to track other types of assets. So being able to put maybe land, a big one is sort of land ownership records on a blockchain, right? As opposed to keeping a centralized database. That's a big use case. Being able to track intellectual property, patents, for example, or being able to. So this is a thing that I've worked on, is being able to transfer software licenses on a blockchain, right? So anything you can transfer, you can potentially transfer on a blockchain, like on a ledger, right? And so the idea behind one of the things that we were working on was that you can take a software license and have it recorded on a blockchain and then have it transferred, be able to transfer it using that blockchain, right? Just like you would with currency, but it's a software license instead.
So essentially anything that you would want to transfer, but very securely and very swiftly, and to still have like complete access to.
Right. And you could do that publicly or privately. There are also private blockchains, right, where you could just have, you could have just, a bunch of banks have access to it. It's just sort of like almost like, in many ways, it's like a Google Doc, right? It's a shared ledger. So you could also have it be a private. I
see. So so when you say it's, everyone in the network sees it, it's only everyone in the network. It's not everyone in the world.
So for the public ones, anyone can go look at the public ones. Yeah, anyone could go look at the Bitcoin ledger. Anyone can go look at that. But there are private blockchains where individual, it's limited to people who have access. Yeah. So those are some of the use cases. That one of the things that's maybe really useful, for example, is doing health records on a blockchain, such that they are encrypted and secure, but also available broadly to people who have the ability who have the, permission to access them.
Oh my gosh, that would be a huge one. Literally yesterday I was venting with a friend and she was venting to me about our own just like health insurance woes and how difficult it is just to get like simple things done, see a specialist, schedule an appointment, get files transferred from one person to the other, how difficult it is. And this, in theory, this would take care of a lot of that.
Yeah. So, the thing about doing health records on a blockchain is that you could also do it sort of in just a centralized database that you have a bunch of all of the healthcare providers have access to. You could do that on a blockchain, or you could do it not on a blockchain. It's, there are reasons that electronic medical records are a very complex and, a system that is not necessarily has not necessarily become this super centralized thing that is not yet at its most efficient point.
Right.
So you could do it on a blockchain. There are also cool things you could do with those records by using a blockchain that maybe you wouldn't be able to use just a regular old database for.
Right.
So, for example, there are companies that are creating things like, you have data. Maybe it's medical record data, or maybe it's other data. Maybe it's data about what websites you're visiting. And what they do is they'll say, okay, people are allowed to, we're going to give right now, right? A lot of your data just gets passed along and you don't know where it's going, right? Someone, and ultimately you get these really, really scary Facebook ads. You're like, wow, how did it, right? Yeah. And you don't know where that came from. And there are all these data brokers and there are all these levels of things going on. One thing you could do, with that data, that would be harder to do without a blockchain, or that blockchain is really a good use case for, is being able to say as a user, I give my permission for my data to be used this way, but not that way. So I give my permission for my medical records to be used for research, but not for whatever.
You can have it built in the code.
Right, exactly. You can have it built into the code, and those permissions can happen automatically. And maybe you could even have something where every time your data is getting used down the line, you're getting some cryptocurrency for it, right? Like, if you think about it, why not have a program
for everything that I transfer, I get money for?
Well, you have your data, and every time, a researcher uses it, you've given your permission for a researcher to use this data. And every time that researcher uses this data, or when a researcher uses that data, you get some cryptocurrency.
Which kind of goes back to the benefit for, say, like artists. Especially musicians, where royalties really matter, or filmmakers or whatnot.
Absolutely.
But they're so easy to take advantage of.
Absolutely, right. So in the current copyright system, a lot of people feel that there isn't a ton of transparency, right? A lot of people will become a member of an organization like ASCAP or BMI, and there's some algorithm that happens about how much you are getting, you as an artist are getting compensated based on how popular your songs are or whatever else. And then there's some algorithm that they have as to, every restaurant they go to, why it is that restaurant should pay them whatever amount that they should pay them. And then, money gets sort of transferred, and we don't really know, it's not a super transparent process, and a lot of people are not necessarily happy with it. And one of the things that's really cool about blockchain is instead of doing that in this way that's really not transparent and really centralized, you could have a decentralized sort of system whereby artists are automatically getting compensated literally for each second of a song that's playing.
Yeah.
Right? Because you're programming your money for every second that a song is playing, it's transferring one millionth of a cent to the songwriter, right? And all this happens automatically. You can see the transactions.
Everyone can see the transaction.
Or only certain people can see the transactions if you want to do your permissions that way, right? You can encrypt it however you want. And ultimately, you have this much more transparent, much more precise system, right? Now, you obviously don't necessarily need to do that with a blockchain, right? You could do that like effectively, this is what happens, with certain, the YouTube is tracking this, right? You're as you're getting
your view time,
right?
View timer times, whatever.
Right, you could do this in a non-blockchain way as well, but doing it on a blockchain sort of allows you to have your transactions happen, with that cryptocurrency automatically, as opposed to having to go through traditional channels.
Are you familiar with the new browser Brave?
Actually, no.
So there's a new browser called Brave. We're going to be utilizing it for the show, and I think they're essentially utilizing this concept, which is, it's a normal browser, Firefox. Why am I forgetting the
Chrome?
Chrome. Thank you, Chrome. Safari. Thank you. There's a lot of terms and words going around right now. Thank you. So it's a browser just like that, but what their whole thing is that they utilize basic attention tokens, which, I know with blockchain, it's either kind of coins or tokens, which we can talk more about. But it's essentially allowing the users to dictate where the money that they, have within the browser, whatever they put in, it goes to where they put their attention within the browser. So instead of people asking for money, donate to my foundation, whatever it is, my show, these content creators, they don't have to worry about that. Wherever they go, whatever websites they enjoy the most, I'm assuming built within the code, whatever, that's where the money's going. I don't know if that's utilizing a smart contract or what it is, but it's just fascinating seeing these industries adapting.
Yeah, that's awesome. That is an awesome use case.
Yeah.
And are they using cryptocurrency, or are they using just traditional money?
It's an ERC20 token.
Awesome. They're using Ethereum.
Yeah.
That's right. There's tons of these projects that are doing exactly that, where they're helping to compensate, and that's what makes the intellectual property aspect so fascinating.
Yeah, absolutely. But we were talking about the decentralization aspect of this. I think this is another aspect that a lot of people are kind of freaked out by, because decentralization kind of means no government intervention, really, or I guess I should say government control. What does that mean exactly with all these transactions that we're talking about? What does this mean for taxes? What does this mean for government being able to track income? Everything, really.
Yeah. So, ultimately, you have no, in the sense of for Bitcoin, you have no Bitcoin corporation that you can go shut down. Right? If you're the government and you want to shut down some company, you can just show up at the company and shut them down, right? That is not the case for Bitcoin, right?
Because it's just everywhere.
It's stored on all these, it's decentralized. It's stored on it's running on all these people's computers all over the world. It's you know, in theory, you could go shut down each of those individual computers, not really in practice.
Yeah.
It's just code ultimately, right? It's code that can then be run on other people, right? So as a result, you have the government can't go shut down Bitcoin. And to be fair, a lot of other cryptocurrency projects are a little more centralized, right? And like you could go shut down that company,
Like
right?
if a bank created their own cryptocurrency to use within their network, like that's more trackable.
Right. Or like a lot of ICOs, right, are actually just tied to a particular company. So you go shut down that company, right? Or whatever, or regulate that company. But I will say that the fact that Bitcoin is not, that you can't go shut down Bitcoin Corporation does not mean that there are not a lot of regulations that are applying still to people who are using Bitcoin, right? I mean, ultimately, at the end of the day, there are countries in the world where using Bitcoin is illegal, right? And you can be arrested for using it, right? And so you're still,
Really?
yeah, absolutely. You're still a person who, you know, is able to be, you as a person, right, are still under some jurisdiction, right? So it's not that everything is a free-for-all. And ultimately, you are subject to, you know, what you're doing with your Bitcoin or with your cryptocurrency is absolutely subject to the laws of the land where you are.
How can they enforce that?
So one example, I think a great example is taxes. So a couple years ago, the IRS looked at the number of people who had reported having cryptocurrency and said, well, gosh, that's a really low number. Like the number of people, you know, whatever, it was like 800 or something. Yeah, it was a low number.
Yeah.
It's like, that's not right. There
Yeah.
are more people than that who have cryptocurrency, who are making transactions. The IRS had actually published a paper saying, here's how you record your cryptocurrency transactions. Here's how they're taxed. Right. And the short version of that is every time you're cashing out your cryptocurrency, right, like either by changing it over to US dollars or buying something with it, the difference in the price from when you bought it to when you used it is taxed as a capital gain or capital loss, right? There's some difference that is being recorded that is ultimately something that's taxable. And so a lot of people had not been reporting that. And so the IRS issued what's called a subpoena, which is just sort of a demand for information to Coinbase. Coinbase is one of the largest cryptocurrency exchanges. And, you know, where people basically are cashing out their Bitcoin for dollars or, you know, their Bitcoin for Ethereum or whatever.
And do you have to go to one of those to a coin exchange to get your money?
If you want to exchange to what's called fiat currency, US dollars, you know, you're going to have to interact with some sort of exchange where you can do that, right? I mean,
Yeah, I guess so.
Right. You could continue to operate just within sort of Bitcoin, right? And there are various other things I theoretically could do, right? Like there are, in some countries, there are Bitcoin meetups where people will like meet up and exchange their Bitcoin. Because remember, exchanging Bitcoin is just exchanging numbers, right? So you could meet up with people in person. And Germany, I believe, has actually banned those, interestingly, which is really interesting.
Yeah. But that's not always practical because a lot of the times you're probably using this for transactions internationally or to people you might not even know.
Right. You could, and you can just sort of continue to exist in the Bitcoin world, right? Or in the cryptocurrency world without cashing out to fiat or without using it for, you know, whatever. But, you know, the point is that Coinbase has a lot of information about a lot of people. And as a lot of people's cryptocurrency transactions. And so there was a sort of fight in court about how much information was going to be turned over, who it was going to be turned over about. Ultimately, they settled on, okay, it's going to be people who have made transactions above a certain amount. I think it was $20,000. That information was getting handed over to the IRS. And the IRS can then go and enforce against people for not complying with laws, right? So that's a perfect example of where the law, you know, the fact that you're using cryptocurrency does not mean you're not subject to these laws, right?
I think a lot of people think of kind of the old stereotypes of Bitcoin of like, you know, like drug dealers and doing illegal, criminal activity online because it's, deregulated or whatnot. I guess what do you think about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So, the thing about Bitcoin is it did sort of get, and cryptocurrency is, it sort of got this reputation as being associated with criminal activity as a result of a lot of the publicity around the Silk Road, which is basically sort of eBay for illegal things,
right,
using cryptocurrency. And cryptocurrency, is used as a medium because it's faster and easier than,
you don't have to go through anyone,
right? And it's anonymized, right?
Yeah.
Exactly. Or in theory anonymized.
Yeah.
And so, in that sense, it's sort of exactly like cash, right? Like a lot of criminals use cash for
point.
that reason, right? And like no one says, well, as a general matter, it is somewhat well accepted that, cash is not a thing that should be banned just because of its association with criminals.
That's very true.
And so as a result, I think the thing about cryptocurrency being used there is it's something where you shouldn't punish you shouldn't it's not about the technology, right? It's about the criminal activity. And, you wouldn't blame Ford for making a getaway car that gets used in a bank robbery,
Sure,
right? And ultimately, there's so many other non-criminal uses, right, for cryptocurrency and for cash, right? That it makes sense to not blame the technology.
Sure. And you're right. Cash is literally the exact same thing.
Right.
If anything, I would think that this makes those things a little bit, this is probably a good and bad thing, but a little bit safer because you don't have to, this could take drug dealers off the streets, which maybe, and I'm literally just thinking this right now, maybe this helps with like gang violence because you don't have to do these transactions in person and make it super dangerous. And I don't know,
that's a super interesting point. And I think that the thing about it is that's also interesting from like a law enforcement perspective is remember that these transactions are being recorded forever on a public ledger.
Right.
Yeah. And they're not, right. So like, it's actually in many ways a lot more trackable than cash, right? In some ways, right? And there are all sorts of things that people can do to make it a little more anonymized, and there are obviously things other than Bitcoin privacy coins. But as a general sort of high level thought, having a transaction recorded forever publicly, that is a criminal transaction doesn't necessarily sound like the smartest thing. And once you find out, that once you maybe go to Coinbase and find out, maybe you subpoena Coinbase and you find out that I am personally am associated with a particular public key, right? You now can see all of my transactions.
Right.
And if you then find out who the other person is.
So it's actually like maybe not a good idea for criminals.
Right. And there are ways that you make it more anonymous. But I agree. And the other thing is there are all sorts of ways that you can sort of analyze these ledgers and glean information from them.
I was going to say, if nothing else, even if they can't say, oh, I know exactly who did this illegal thing, it's at least more information to maybe track somewhere else, or just because I'm sure that's what they just want at the end of the day is just data and information to do something with.
Absolutely. And so like I like to analogize it to this technology of sort of analyzing ledgers is something that is really advancing. And I analogize it to the Olympic Committee, which, when they test athletes' blood, they actually keep the blood after the fact for a number of years because they realize that the technology for testing the blood, for drugs is actually going to advance, right? So they keep the blood. This is a ledger that is forever going to be public, right? And who knows what kind of technology is going to allow that to be analyzed, right? And so, that is definitely something to take into consideration in considering whether Bitcoin is, or cryptocurrencies generally are something that, should be fairly associated with criminal activity.
Right.
Yeah.
Another advantage that I've heard about that I think could be a big game changer is just international transactions, is particularly for people in third world countries. I don't know if you can speak to that a little bit, but I hadn't even thought of this until, like talking about it with people. And it's so simple to use. You know, all you need is some kind of device with internet access. And this could be huge for you know, small, whatever, farmers, you know, artisans, you know, artists, whatever, in countries that otherwise wouldn't get much business.
Absolutely, yeah. So the term that's used often is the unbanked, right? There are a lot of people who do not have bank accounts.
Right. Can't get loans, can't store their money anywhere safe.
Absolutely.
Sure.
Absolutely.
Or the governments are super corrupt.
Right, absolutely. Or, you know, and there are reasons that maybe the money in their country, there's a high amount of inflation, there's something going on where you don't necessarily, the fiat currency associated with the government is not necessarily something you want to actually be storing your value in, right? I met this person who had a company that was just doing international transfers using cryptocurrency, and he was telling me this story about why he got so interested in cryptocurrency. And the reason was he had grown up in a time, there was some period of his life when he was a child where the country he was living in had this extremely rapid inflation to the point where people were literally running through the grocery store, like physically running, because by the time you got to the register, the prices would have gone up, right?
Jeez.
So it's like physically racing. And that was something that, as a result of that, he got really interested in the concept of being able to have your money in something that's not tied to a particular government, right? And so you can really see where that, coming from a different perspective than, you know, you and I have in the US, is something that could potentially be really powerful.
Wow. That's so crazy. Wow. Anyway, I also wanted to ask you about the double spend problem and how this works around that.
Yeah, absolutely.
And what it is.
Sure, absolutely. So going back to sort of the history of Bitcoin and blockchain, there had been a lot of attempts at creating digital cash before Bitcoin. And what you're talking about, the double spend problem, is the issue that, you know, if I have an apple, like a physical apple, and I hand you the apple, I no longer have the apple and you now have the apple, right? It's like a physical object in space that we can move. The problem is digital apples are not like physical apples, right? A digital apple, I can just create over, like a picture of an apple, right? I can just copy and, you know.
Because it's a file.
Right, exactly. And it's not the same thing as a physical object. And so this is the problem with, you know, being able to transfer money digitally without using these centralized ledgers, is if I want to hand you a $20 bill, I no longer have it, you now have it. If I say, you know, I'm sending you $20, here's a picture of a $20 bill or whatever, or numbers that signify a $20 bill, you know, that is something that you could then maybe spend twice, right? Like, how do you keep track of whether you've spent it or not? And the answer to that is you have a public ledger that everyone can see, where everyone knows you've already spent that money, that value.
And it's been verified by these miners, by multiple people.
Right. And so as a result, that was sort of what the key insight sort of in the sort of creation of Bitcoin, right? So back in 2008, there was this group of cypher-punks who...
What are cypher-punks?
These are people who are very passionate about cryptography and using it to sort of evade...
Are you talking kind of like the anarchy? No, not on anarchy, but like hyper libertarian type.
So the cypherpunks are people like John Gilmore, who's one of the co-founders of EFF, or Julian Assange, right?
Okay, right.
And these are people who are cryptographers and who are very passionate about using cryptography to allow, you know, to sort of create a world in which people don't necessarily need to fear the government or things of that sort of nature. And they had this thing called the cryptography mailing list, which was just a mailing list of a bunch of cypherpunks. These are people who are very influential sort of in the early internet. And so back on Halloween 2008.
Oh, so
I know, it's so specific. Well, it's nice because you can sort of think back to like, oh, what was my Halloween costume that year? And you can kind of, right? Like if you can remember your Halloween costume in 2008, you can like be like, oh, that's where I was the moment that Bitcoin sort of became a thing.
Funny.
Isn't that cool?
Yeah.
So like I remember, you sort of remember.
You just saying 2008. I'm like, God, that seems so, I mean, I guess it was 10 years ago, but like 10 years is not a long time.
Right. No, and it's not. Absolutely. Yeah. And this was, so what happened was someone going by the name of Satoshi Nakamoto, a pseudonym, yes, Satoshi Nakamoto, emailed out a white paper to the group and said, here's my idea for this, way to solve the double spend problem, this way to create a way to transfer value. And this was sort of the canonical paper about Bitcoin and what it is and, how this would work and how this cryptography works. And so, initially it was just an email, like with this really short white paper, right? Little kind of anticlimactic. And, there were a few emails back and forth about like why this is a terrible idea and won't really work. And then there were some people who said, oh, that's actually a really interesting idea. I'll help you like build the software for it. And ultimately, fast forward.
And that's how blockchain was created.
Right. Blockchain and Bitcoin simultaneously, right? Because Bitcoin is sort of the first use case of blockchain. Yeah.
And now, so we've talked about Bitcoin, cryptocurrencies. I know that sometimes the terms coins and digital tokens there's some confusion with those. Can you tell me a little bit about the differences?
Yeah. So it's
like
yes, I can. So I mean it's somewhat of a marketing thing, right? How do you want to market, right?
Okay.
How do you want to market when you create a cryptocurrency? How do you want to market it? And cryptocurrency sort of gives the sense that this is a currency, right? Or maybe that this is something that one would invest in, right? And as opposed to something that's more like a Chuck E. Cheese token, where it's a thing that is useful in a particular context, right? So people use the term token, like, so you'll hear the term token sale used instead of initial coin offering, right? And people use that term because it's sort of signifying, okay, this is a token that is used for a purpose that is not necessarily being marketed. Maybe it is, maybe it isn't, but not necessarily being marketed as an investment tool.
Sure. So maybe for like a security or a commodity as opposed to an actual like fiat currency. So
I think the way to sort of to sort of talk about that distinction, it probably is important to like cover the big picture thing that's going on with whether these things are securities. So a security, is sort of an investment vehicle, right? And this is something that is regulated by the Securities and Exchange Commission, among other sort of government agencies, at least in the US, right? And when people created their own cryptocurrencies and would sort of market it as, this is my company, I've created this coin with my company's name on it, you should buy this, as people sometimes would market it as an investment in my company. Even though you're not actually buying equity in my company, you're just buying a coin with my name on it and betting that it's going to go up in value as my company gets more successful.
So it wasn't stock.
It's not stock. Absolutely not. It is these sort of so-called ICOs, initial coin offerings, we've created this coin, it has our name on it or some other name on it.
I see. Okay.
We're selling it to the public. And or selling it to private investors or whatever. We're selling it to someone as an initial coin offering, like an initial public offering for securities, right? and people sometimes there's a huge question as to whether how you do that in a way, or whether you can do that in a way where it is not actually a security. And if it is a security, right, there are all sorts of regulations that apply. You
Sure.
need to register it as a security with the SEC. There's state regulations. You need to, there are public disclosure requirements about what's going on at your company, right? And so a lot of, for obvious reasons, to avoid that regulation, many ICOs did not, up until recently, very few of them ever were like, yes, we are a security and we're going to jump through the hoops necessary, right? They're just like, no, we're just making this thing and it's not a security. And the SEC often disagreed and has made itself clear so remember when we talked about the distributed autonomous organization earlier, there was a question as to whether that was an unregistered security, whether creating the distributed autonomous organization and having a bunch of people invest their money in it with the idea that money would, that was an investment and they would ultimately get more money back, whether that was a security. And the SEC said, yes, that was a security, and that should have been registered and didn't sort of retroactively, no one went to jail, right? But it was they made it very clear, like, this is how that analysis goes.
Oh gosh. So now they're very clear on, or I guess I should say a little more clear.
Yeah. So I think that's a big question in this space, is a lot of people who are creating tokens or coins, who are creating these new cryptocurrencies, have a question as to whether they are a security or not a security. This is a big part of the legal landscape right now, especially those who really see themselves as Chuck E. Cheese tokens, right? They're saying, no. What we've created is not something that we want people to invest in because they think it's going to go up in value, but rather just a thing that you can use on our platform. Just like when you go to...
Like a coupon or a frequent flyer miles or something like that.
Exactly. Like, you can use this cryptocurrency or token or coin on our platform. And it's just like you would go to Chuck E. Cheese and exchange your money for Chuck E. Cheese tokens.
Like the attention token we were talking about for the Brave browser. I don't think anyone would think that they're going to get any, value from that. It's just going to be distributed how they think it's going to, on the websites that they go to.
Well, and so that's a question, right? The question is, if you're using it as a Chuck E. Cheese token, but you then market it to people as like, this is going to be such an amazing platform, and the platform's going to do so well that people are going to ultimately be paying more US dollars for these tokens, then
it gets tricky.
Then you're maybe marketing it as a security, and that is potentially dangerous. So you want to be really careful, right, about your marketing. And the question, and there still is a question, right, as to whether that is a security in the first place, regardless of how you're marketing it. And there's sort of a test for that, but the Supreme Court has made it very clear that the test for what is and is not a security is facts, circumstances, and economic realities test, meaning that, like, ultimately it's not about checking a box, right? It's really about the economic realities of what's going on.
Wow, you lawyers have your work cut out for you.
At least the securities lawyers do.
Yeah. You're like, okay,
right.
But on that note, let's jump into what you do specifically with blockchain and intellectual property.
Yeah, absolutely. So there are a couple really interesting areas right now developing in intellectual property. So the first is just the patenting activity going on in blockchain. And then the second is sort of how blockchain can affect intellectual property. So we sort of covered the second one a little bit. But on the first one, for years, there's been this huge increase in the number of patents that are being applied for and issued on blockchain technologies, right? On improvements to blockchain. These typically, the patents that are being issued are typically falling into two categories. They're either sort of things that are improvements to sort of how you do blockchain, right? So some, algorithm for querying a blockchain really quickly, or so, some sort of blockchain related technology in that way, or they're applications of blockchain. So blockchain for supply chain, where you can track an object as it goes through the supply chain using a blockchain.
But these are all rooted in the blockchain.
Right.
The blockchain code.
These are blockchain related patents, right? So there are a lot of patents that have been, and this is just something that has been really increasing. I mean, as you would really expect, right? And so a lot of companies are really nervous that these patents can be used in a way that would be harmful for the blockchain ecosystem as a whole, right? And it's sort of, in many ways, a lot of people feel like the open source ethos of blockchain is not in line with the concept of patenting blockchain. Right. A lot of companies, their engineers do not like patents, right? In a lot of cases, and they're saying, they don't want their inventions to be patented. They're worried that down the line these patents are going to be used to sue companies that maybe are startups that are then not going to be able to pay legal fees that are going to go under. There are these things called patent trolls. Okay. So
I don't know.
All right. So since we're on this topic, that's one of the major concerns is that patent trolls are going to get blockchain patents. So a patent is basically just, a limited monopoly on an invention. So you invent something, and for X number of years, 20 years, you are able to exclude others from using that invention, regardless of whether they invented it independently, right? So if I patented a pen and you also came up with the idea for a pen and started making pens and maybe never knew about me or my patent, right?
But you got it first.
But I got a patent on it, right? I can sue you and say, no. You don't get to use pens. You have to pay me a bunch of money if you want to use pens, right? And this makes sense the fundamental concept of patents is that you are disclosing your invention to the public, right? In your patent, you're saying, here's how this works. And in 20 years, when my patent expires, my invention will be open to the public, right? Anyone can use it. And I'm disclosing this knowledge as opposed to keeping it a secret. In return, I'm getting a monopoly that's going to allow me to extract revenues from other people who want to use my invention. And therefore, I will be able to recoup my cost of R&D. So it makes total sense in the pharma context, right? You have a pharma company that spends $1 billion creating this drug. And the second that it says to the public, oh, we figured out that this chemical compound, does X, cures this disease, anyone can just go copy it. Yeah. So why would
without the research, without the development that they had to invest all that time and money into.
Right. So why would they, why would they spend $1 billion, right? The incentive wouldn't be there for them if they didn't have the ability to recoup that. So in that context, right, with that in mind, it makes sense that you have patents, right? It makes sense that you can see that the point of a patent is to incentivize innovation. And it makes sense in a pharma context. The problem is when you are talking about something like a software program that someone wrote in their basement overnight, right?
Yeah.
That's getting the same amount of protection as the $1 billion pharmaceutical drug, right? And what happens is there are a lot of, and often, right, these are written, let's say you have a pharmaceutical patent, okay, it's X chemical compound. It's pretty clear what you have invented, what you've got covered. Very different in a software context, right?
Because you're pretty much using the same resources as every other programmer out there.
Right. And it's also sort of easier to be kind of wishy-washy about it, right? Method for transferring data over a network. Well, what does that apply to? What did you actually invent? It has the ability to be really overbroad. So you've seen a lot of misuse of especially software patents, particularly from sort of the earlier days of the internet. And what that led to is these things called patent trolls. And patent trolls, the polite word for them is non-practicing entities, NPEs, or patent assertion entities, PAEs.
I like patent trolls.
Patent trolls, right? No, right, exactly. Like some courts won't let you use the word, but you know, luckily this is not that context. So patent trolls, it works really well because you know, a troll is under a bridge and it like is demanding money to cross the bridge. The idea is that a patent troll it's a company that does nothing. They don't have any product, service,
They don't
nothing.
produce anything.
They don't produce anything. Maybe it's just a lawyer, maybe it's just a guy, or some dude, right? And they go and they buy a patent, or maybe they invented themselves, or whatever. But canonically, they buy a patent. Maybe a startup went under, for example. A startup went into bankruptcy. Their patents went on the market. A patent troll goes and buys this patent. It then goes to all these companies that are actually innovating, right? And it says, you know, I have this patent for transferring data over a network, and you are clearly transferring data over a network, so you're going to have to pay me a bunch of money or I'm going to sue you.
Oh, wow.
Right? Because that's the whole point, is they can exclude others from using this technology. And obviously they didn't invent it, and they didn't, you know, and it's maybe you as a company agree that you're doing the thing in the patent, or maybe you actually don't. Maybe you're like, no, actually, we're not doing that. We actually invented something that's a way different way of doing it, and we're doing it in a different way. The problem is, in order to get that settled, you're going to have to go to court, right? You're going to have to go fight a really lengthy battle and spend a lot of money. And, you know, as a company, you have to make a decision. Do you just pay them off to go away? And that's going to be a lot less than the attorney's
Which is
fees,
what they're banking on.
Right? Or do you fight it and spend a bunch of money? And by the way, at the end, even if you're totally right, the people who are deciding in traditional court cases, the people who decide whether your patent is valid and whether the company is practicing the patent is just jurors from like just some guy. Like it's just a regular jury of people from that community. It's not like technical experts.
Right.
And they could give a really huge amount of money to this, right? It's you're rolling the dice. You're hoping that this jury, right. So you can see why companies would not necessarily take that route and would potentially just pay them off. And that's why these patent trolls have proliferated. And this is a huge problem in the technology space, and something that a lot of people talk about. And so in the blockchain space, right, you can see why, you know, starting years ago, seeing all these patents being filed, you know, by startups that maybe are going to go under and maybe are going to have their patents put on the market and bankruptcy proceedings, right? Like why that makes people in the industry so nervous.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And so, right. And so the idea is, so the question is, what do you do as an industry, right? When you have these patents, like, and, you know, there are all sorts of good reasons that you as a company would want to patent your invention, right? Your investors really want you to patent it. You want to make clear to future, if someone else wants to patent it in the future, right? You want to be really clear. No, we invented it first, right? So you want to have
just to set stipulations for the future,
right? You want to have it on record in the patent office. Yeah. All sorts of good reasons you'd want to patent something. On the other hand, right, then you're sort of increasing the potential for patent trolls to get a hold of this in the future. And your engineers are not going to be happy with you often because they're, you know, very into this open source ethos. So what do you do? And so there are all sorts of options that you have that are things that the blockchain industry has been looking into doing. And so there are various things you can do. You can do things called patent pledges, which is basically just patenting something, but then doing something with those patents that gives up some of your rights in them in some way. So, for example, Elon Musk made the news for just essentially pledging his patent portfolio to the public. He just said, you know, I really think that in literally a blog post, he said, I think that the public space, I think that the electric car industry, you know, could really benefit from everyone using this technology as a result. And as a result, Tesla will benefit because there will be more infrastructure out there for Teslas.
Oh, wow. I didn't know he did that.
Yeah, he did. And so he said, you know, here you go, public. we've patented all this stuff, but it's dedicated to you. So that's a pure example of a patent pledge. Another thing you could do is that Twitter did is Twitter said, okay, we're going to give our inventors veto power over what happens to the patent down the line. So this is called the Innovators Patent Agreement. So they said, if you're an inventor and you invent a patent that gets, that's as a part of Twitter, that as an employee of Twitter, and that gets patented and assigned to Twitter, we can't offensively assert it against anyone down the line, or it can't be offensively asserted against anyone down the line without your permission. Right? So they've given their inventors veto power. So that's another way where you can sort of have a patent pledge that gives up some right in your patent in order to be able to down the line make sure that the patents...
Can you give an example of that one? Like the Twitter example specifically?
Yeah, absolutely. So if I'm an employee of Twitter, I invent something, it gets patented. It's actually, interestingly enough, this one's a little different than others. Interestingly enough, it actually is a clause in the employment contract, and it basically says their employment contract with the inventors say, you have the ability to veto any lawsuit we want to bring offensively in the future. So if we ever wanted to sue someone who hasn't already sued us, like, you get to say, no, you can't do that.
Regarding that patent.
Oh,
okay.
Right. Huh. Yeah. So that's one way to do it. Or you can have an entire industry. And by the way, on the Twitter Innovators Patent Agreement, there are blockchain companies that do that. For example, there's a blockchain company called Blockstream that has actually adapted Twitter's Innovators Patent Agreement and just made it more stringent. And so they actually are using Twitter's IPA. So that's one way you could do it. Or you could have everyone in the industry, right, opt into almost like a patent pool where everyone contributes all of their patents and says, so you can do this instead of, so the two examples I gave are unilateral, right? You're just giving up some of your own patent rights and you're getting nothing in return. But you could do this where the entire industry gets together and says, everyone who agrees to sort of give everyone else rights to their patents in this pool gets rights to my patents, right?
Oh,
and you
that's
create
this really interesting concept,
right? And so you're giving up some of your own patent rights to those other people in the network.
Oh, it's kind of like is it GitHub? I can't remember. There's a platform online where a lot of developers will do this. They'll go online, they'll share their code with people so they can use the, whatever the small software piece it is, a plugin, whatever it is. Feel free to use it. But the entire point of the platform is like, you use my stuff, I can use your stuff. So it is open source, but I think it's more open source it is open source, but to the members or the people that take advantage of it.
Right. Like this is a way of doing essentially open source patent licensing is a good way of thinking of it. Like open source, but instead of for copyright, it's for patents. And you can do that in multiple, you can have it be, everyone has access to the patents. So there's something called the defensive patent license, which by the way, Blockstream is also a member of. So there are blockchain companies doing this. Where it's exactly as I described. Everyone just gets access to everyone else's patents. That actually has not been very popular to date, just because it's a collective action problem. There's also one called the License on Transfer Network. The idea is you can still sue everyone else in the pool, but instead of what you can't do is once you transfer it out to a patent troll, so let's say you're a startup, you're a member, you go under and your patent gets transferred to a troll. At that point, everyone else in the network gets a license, i.e. cannot be sued with the patent. Yeah. So that's like a really popular one. And there's also, the Open Invention Network does this for Linux. The Open Invention Network is essentially why Linux has become such a huge success. And the reason it's essentially created a patent no-fly zone around Linux technology. So for years, the blockchain industry has been talking about, well, how do we do that? How do we for blockchain basically create a no-fly zone with patents where we don't, as an industry, have to worry about a blockchain patent war really undermining innovation in the field. So that's
interesting.
That landscape. Yeah.
Are you able to give me an example of any cases that you guys have already tried or settled or whatever, that you can talk about publicly? Yeah,
so these aren't cases, right? These aren't like litigations, and to date there really hasn't been a pure blockchain patent lawsuit in the US. And these are rather industry groups that are trying to come up with some solution because they're really worried about the potential for patent litigation in the space. And particularly worried about startups, being extorted by patent trolls and going under and it quashing innovation. So what we do is, advise on, these types of strategies, what companies can do to, to collaborate to reduce the threat of patent litigation for everyone. And, to date, there are all sorts of things that are in the works, and this has been an ongoing thing for years. And this is actually how I first got involved in the blockchain space. Was I had written a paper called "Hacking the Patent System" that lays out all these options for startups and says here are the pros and cons of each possible patent pledge you can do. So this was published by the Electronic Frontier Foundation and Engine Advocacy, and as a result, had been asked to help the blockchain industry come up with some solution here. It's still in the works. There are various options. People, as I mentioned, Blockstream has already been opting into several of these options, and a lot of other companies are looking at it. Because if you're the general counsel of a blockchain company, right, you are under an extreme amount of stress from your investors to a lot of pressure to patent. There are a lot of good reasons for you to patent. In order to, make sure no one else gets there first, or even if you invented it first. And at the same time, your engineers are like, what? Yeah. You want to patent my invention? A lot of engineers see this as really being totally antithetical to the concept of open source, right? Which is at the heart of blockchain. And so you as a general counsel are under a lot of competing pressures. Yeah. And so what do you do? How do you patent stuff, but in an open source way? And the answer is these sort of potential strategies. So that's my super area of interest where all of the things I love are combined.
Yeah. Is this a conversation that is happening within the tech space and also with other law firms? I know obviously your firm is jumping into it. Do you know if other firms are?
Yeah, so I think generally I think lawyers generally are getting much more savvy very quickly about blockchain. So like in 2015, when I was doing blockchain law, and if you were a lawyer who knew anything about blockchain, you were just like,
you were the lawyer.
Yeah, you were the lawyer.
Blockchain.
Right? No, right, exactly. And I think it's still the legal field is definitely a little behind some of the other fields in terms of getting savvy with blockchain, but definitely a huge increase in the number of lawyers who are involved, which is great, especially as there will be more lawsuits and there's more regulation and policy considerations. And
yeah. Is there anything that you wish people would know, like the general public would know, just your position, maybe something that you have to explain all the time that you think, would make your job easier, just something that you wish the general population kind of knew about what you did, or the blockchain space, or the intellectual property space?
Yeah, I think that so there's this concept of privacy by design, right? Where you build in, and this is unrelated to blockchain, but like when you're building a product, you build in privacy to the design of the product, right? You don't build a product and then afterwards say, gosh, what are all the legal and what are all the privacy implications here, right? Rather, during the design process, you are thinking about privacy considerations and really making that part of the product itself. And I think that, especially in the blockchain space, there is a temptation to say, oh, well, blockchain is, not super regulated, and or that's the perception. This is something, we don't believe that, the laws should apply to us, right? There's this ethos around that,
anarchy, right? Type stereotype we were talking about.
Yeah, and I think that the thing is that it is a much more productive strategy to think about how the laws are going to apply to you in advance, right? Rather than having lawyers come in and mop up the mess afterwards, but really have it be part of the design. And a lot of companies are doing that, particularly a lot of the more established players who are patenting in the space, or the more established players in the space generally. And I think that's something that that companies should really keep in mind, that, ultimately lawyers, are not necessarily just there to say, no, you can't do that, but really to help you design something thoughtfully, to save you some trouble down the line.
Yeah. Are there any reoccurring other issues that we haven't brought up yet that you're dealing with a lot in your field that maybe I can't even think of that you're seeing?
So I think the major issue is, and the major tension at the moment is how regulation, I think there are a couple things. I think the first thing is how much regulation and what kind of regulation is the right regulation. Should industry be self-regulating, for example? So there are a lot of industry groups out there that are working on self-regulation and coming up with industry standards that allow the consumers to allow for sort of consumer protection without necessarily needing regulatory intervention, right? So a lot of people are collaborating. A lot of companies are collaborating to create these industry standards. So one of the groups, for example, is Global Digital Finance, GDF, and they've just published this really fabulous draft several actually really fabulous drafts of these industry standards for various things, right? And, ultimately what you need there is industry-wide collaboration, right? Like you can do so much with, when you are collaborating as an industry. And so these trade groups, trade associations, are really vital. And they're also vital in developing things like standards, right? We talked about medical records earlier. I mean, that's a place where you really see the fact that there wasn't an adoption early on of technological standards, right? Meant that none of them did particularly well. Adopting a standard across an industry ultimately has benefits for everyone.
Sure.
So that's, I think, collaboration is something that's been a huge part of the narrative in the last, more and more increasingly. And I think that's huge and really important.
Yeah. Interesting. Well, I mean, I think that is a ton of information as it is. And, so, I mean, you've answered a ton of my questions, given me a lot of clarity on things, and I'm sure our viewers a lot of clarity on blockchain, what you do as a blockchain intellectual property lawyer. So, I mean, thank you so much for just giving us all of that information. I think it's kind of a lot to digest, but also, to me anyway, it's making more and more sense the more that I look into it. The way I kind of look at it is becoming more part of our everyday. So it's just a matter of time, really, is the way I look at it.
Absolutely. Right. Absolutely. I mean, I think it's more and more, it's going to become a bigger and bigger part of our lives. And whether or not we see it at the surface level, blockchain will be a much bigger part. It's sort of the internet in 1992 right now.
I was exactly I was just about to say that. We were just looking at a video of, it was Good Morning LA or some early morning talk show back in the 80s or 90s, and I think it was Katie Couric and a couple other people that are still working today, and they're literally asking the questions, what is email? And they show the the @ symbol, and they're like, so I think you create a name and then this thing and then it sends it, okay, whatever, we'll see. And
right, email is a great analogy, right? Email is a great analogy to cryptocurrency as the first use case of blockchain, right? Email is the first sort of really wide use case of the internet, but you can see that there's so much more you can do. And it's a lot like the internet in that the internet sort of made information really the internet really made it took the transaction costs of transferring information and made them near zero.
Yeah.
And blockchain is taking the transaction costs of transferring value and making it near zero.
Yeah.
So just like you can send a movie as an attachment to an email, suddenly you can send value without, in the same way.
Wow.
And so I think it's a really good analogy when you compare it to the internet in 1992. That's where we are in blockchain right now.
20, 30 years from now, we're going to be like, it's going to be like nothing.
Right, and it may just be, and right, and there may be, better versions of it or different, but this is definitely something that's like a huge part of technological development, certainly in the next couple of years.
Well, it's exciting to be on the forefront of it. So thank you so much for giving us that breakdown.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been such a pleasure and like so fun to talk about. My favorite thing to talk about. So
good. That's what we like.
Yeah.
That is what we like. So thank you so much. We'll have to have you come back on, get into the weeds even more down the road.
Great. I would love that. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Yes.
Hey everyone, thanks so much for watching the episode. If you're interested in contributing to the conversation and supporting the show, there's 2 easy things you can do. 1, click subscribe, and 2, visit our Patreon page where you get exclusive access to the Exploring Minds community.